Not sure if you can hear that. My daughter's yelling in the background. Hopefully that will.
That's great. And the yard crews here always get started seemingly right at 5 o'clock. Somehow they figured me out. That's all right.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 58th of the COVID Calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, we're going to talk about wildfire and COVID-19 with Max Moritz, a fire ecologist and director of the Moritz Lab at the University of California in Santa Barbara. You can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to COVID Calls on the YouTube channel and you can watch live. You can also hear COVID Calls recorded as podcasts on podbean.com. I saw that we just arrived on Spotify yesterday and should be iTunes soon. So anywhere that you catch podcasts, you should be able to catch COVID Calls. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USofDisaster or @COVIDCalls. Please do help spread the word, send suggestions for guests, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, June 3rd, 2020, there are 6,445,457 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 6,325,303 cases reported yesterday. 1,841,629 of those are in the United States, up from 1,820,523 reported yesterday. There are now a total of 106,696 deaths reported in the United States from COVID-19, up from 105,644 deaths reported yesterday. As a way to bring humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story every day, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is, "She Held the Family Together. San Jose Woman is First Known U.S. COVID-19 Death." This was written by David DeBolt and appeared on April 24th, 2020 in the Mercury News. Something felt strange about Patricia Dowd's death. Dowd, 57, had no heart issues and strong lungs. She ate well, exercised, and recently had seen her doctor. So when the San Jose woman died February 6th of an apparent heart attack, her husband asked for an autopsy to determine what killed her. The flu-like symptoms Dowd experienced in her final days, it turned out, were COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus. Dowd now is the first known person in the United States to die from the virus. She was in shape, Dowd's brother Ricardo Cabello said in an interview. She did spin class. She was always doing some kind of aerobics. Though she did not name Dowd publicly, Santa Clara County Health Officer Dr. Sarah Cody said that her death, as well as two others on February 17th and March 6th, are evidence that the coronavirus was spreading on the West Coast weeks earlier than initially believed. All three of the deaths occurred at home and appeared to have been the result of community transmission. Records from the County Medical Examiner's Office reviewed by the Mercury News Organization shows deaths rose 20% in March of this year compared to the same month last year. County officials said total deaths in the county have risen as much as 25% over 2019. On the eve of Cody's stunning announcement, County Executive Jeff Smith noted how quickly the virus can kill. "It's not the kind of virus that waits around," he said. "Some people are dead within a few days of diagnosis." Smith very well could have been talking about Dowd. Just a few weeks before her death, on January 19th, the senior quality manager at Fremont-based Lam Research Corporation had invited family over to watch the 49ers playoff game. Her brother said she was healthy at the time. A few weeks later, on February 1st, Dowd was supposed to attend a funeral of a high school friend in Stockton, Cabello said. Both he and Dowd had attended St. Francis High School in Mountain View. She was a class of 1980. He doubted his truck could get him to the service, so his sister offered to drive him. But on the day of the funeral, she backed out. "I just realized today that she saved my life," Cabello said in an interview. "She called me that morning and told me she couldn't go. She wasn't feeling well. She died 5 days later." Dowd was the kind of 57-year-old who kept in close touch with friends from St. Joseph's Grammar School. Jim Carcass, 58, first met Dowd, then Cabello, in the first grade. and they were part of the same tight-knit group for more than 40 years. Through her 50s, Dowd was beloved by different cadres of close friends, Karkas said, from a scrapbooking group to her Lamb colleagues to fellow members of the San Francisco High School marching band where she had been a flag girl. Dowd had a loud, contagious laugh that rang through annual holiday parties and monthly hangouts with the high school gang, relatives and friends said. At Christmas with family, she wanted to sit at a place where she would be looking at the faces of the kids and the brothers and sisters that were opening the presents she gave them, said Cabello. After their mother died, he added, she held the family together. She was just true, Karkas said, remembering that when his parents died, she made a point to drop by his house a few miles away in San Jose regularly, just to talk. Would be there for you, whatever it takes. Dowd was not at work the day she died, but had been in contact with a coworker, as was her habit. She always was quick to reply to a text or an email, those who knew her said. So when the text messages she had been sending the colleague suddenly stopped, Cabello said, people started to think something was wrong. She always answered text messages, he said. 2 hours later, her adult daughter found her dead. Around 700 people attended Dowd's funeral in Mountain View, which took place 3 weeks after her death, before local and state shelter-in-place orders ended such gatherings. Those who knew her have been left trying to put two and two together, Karkas said. In November, Dowd traveled to Beijing for work. In January, she went to Oregon. Nobody knows where she picked up coronavirus. Still, amidst the confusion and against the backdrop of a worldwide pandemic, they've continued to grieve. There's a lot of questions that we're all obviously trying to answer. It depresses the heck out of us, Karkas said. I want to shout out to the world and say, this person's not a stat. She was just an unbelievable person. All right, I'd like to turn to our discussion for today and introduce my guest, Max Moritz. Max Moritz is a wildfire specialist at the University of California Cooperative Extension, part of the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. He now manages the Moritz Lab, his lab from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he's an adjunct professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management, and he's also an affiliate of the Earth Research Institute. Much of his research is focused on understanding the dynamics of fire regimes at relatively broad scales and applying this information to planning and management of fire-prone landscapes. He's used a number of different spatial approaches to quantitative analysis of fire history patterns stemming from his early work on chaparral shrublands in the Santa Barbara region. He's very widely published, does a lot of public education, and just in full disclosure, Max and I have also published together, and we would encourage you to take a look at a piece, and I have to give Max 98% of the credit for this, a piece that appeared in American Scientist in 2016 called Coexisting with Wildfire, which now does seem almost like a century ago to me. Max, welcome to COVID Calls.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, that does seem like a long time ago, but thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. I usually start these just by asking people where they're calling in from and how things are there. So let's do that. Where are you now, and what's the situation with the pandemic there?
So I'm calling from my home office here in Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara, I think we were doing pretty well. Relatively low numbers of cases. I think the public here is pretty proactive in Santa Barbara. It's a very, very activist culture, and so I think when the orders came through to shelter in place, people took it very seriously, and we saw everybody wearing masks. People were really, really following the rules, for what that's worth. I think more recently, California has kind of relaxed some of the restrictions Santa Barbara has. We have some outdoor dining, and that's coinciding with the start of the tourist season here. So actually, we're seeing a lot of people that probably aren't, they're not locals, they're not from here. A lot less people wearing masks, gatherings, quite a bit larger than we would have seen even just a few weeks ago on the beaches and in the parks. So I think some of us are kind of wondering what we're going to see as a result. but anyway, it so far has been pretty good, I think.
I'm going to ask you about how you're able to do your research at this time. It's having been lucky enough to be out into field sites with you previously. It's very hard for me to imagine you cooped up in the house trying to get ready for wildfire season. And I'm not sure that term even means anything to people anymore, but I'm gonna use it, and you can correct me. But we are moving towards a period of time when historically you expect more fires, and it should be a time of preparedness, right? So, how has the pandemic shaped that?
Yeah, it has had an impact. I mean, my own personal situation. We have some of our projects that are, they're research projects, computer modeling of fire probabilities and hazard patterns and things like that you could really do anywhere. So people on my team that are working on those questions are not as disrupted, right? They can work from the home or wherever is most effective and safe for them. Some of the field work that we had planned for this coming season has really gotten impacted, right? We're off to a very slow start because some of those people ended up, moving back to the town that they grew up in and working remotely part-time until things can ramp back up. And so we're looking at the fire season starting up, and we don't have the crews out there doing the sampling. This project is looking at plant water stress and ability, for example, and so our plan was to have the fire season where everything greens up and then track it all the way through down to the end before the rain start. And I'm still hopeful that we're gonna get that going, but it's definitely gotten a slow start. And I think overall, fire preparedness has similarly, I don't want to say it's stalled, but the training season for firefighters, for example, if you wanted to bring new people on, coincided with the onset of the COVID restrictions, right? So I think the word that I've heard is that the crews are quite a bit smaller as a result of that. Wildfire preparedness efforts. We had Wildfire Preparedness Week recently, and I don't want to say it came and went without any hoopla, but it certainly wasn't your Wildfire Preparedness Week. We had a large community event planned where we were going to have speakers, and that was canceled. And so I think that the other example would be our Fire Safe Council. We have these relatively small community groups that get together and look for grants or discuss problems that we want to tackle, and so on. And we haven't met, right, for weeks and weeks and weeks. So all these things are symptomatic of probably what's going on across a good deal of the Western U.S. As we head into the fire season.
Can you just break it down for us a little bit? I mean, you live in a part of the country where wildfire and wildfire preparedness are thoroughly enmeshed in civil society, but people may not be as familiar with who really manages things there. There's Cal Fire, and then there's sort of local governance that's involved, and even individual homeowners and community organizations I know are engaged too. Could you just say a little bit more so we can understand how deeply enmeshed it is in the society there?
Yeah, it is, depending on where you live. And Santa Barbara is a great example. We've had fires historically that have burned right into the neighborhoods, the wildland urban interface, we call it, the WUI. So it's on everybody's mind in a place like this. Increasingly, we've had fires burn into urbanized portions of Northern California. So it's really, that's been happening in Southern California for a long time, but it's really becoming, kind of a way of life to become, to get ready for the fire season and to know what you're going to do when and if an event occurs. A lot of that outreach, a lot of that extension and outreach falls into the hands of the agencies, right? And some of it falls into the hands of academics or cooperative extension, like myself. At the statewide level, we have Cal Fire, who basically is kind of the fire department for the state, if you want to think of it that way. If there's a lot of what we would call state responsibility areas that are not under the jurisdiction, at least from a fire perspective and from a building perspective. They're not a local. There's no local authority, right? And so these tend to be more rural areas, and so the state, if there's a fire, the state is in charge of coming to deal with that, and for pre-fire activities or defensible space inspections, the state is also responsible for that. So CAL FIRE is the state entity. And then in every county, you have often a county fire department, or sometimes CAL FIRE plays that role at the county level. But we here have a county fire department, and then as you get to finer and finer scales, you often have local fire departments. There'll be Santa Barbara City, or Carp Summerland, or Montecito. Mm-hmm. So all of those agencies have different scales of responsibility, I guess, and they all try to put out fires and prepare for the fire season and get the word out to the civilians, as they sometimes call them.
And did they all have their own firefighters? I mean, are we thinking about corps of firefighters at these many different levels who are prepared to go into action?
Yep. And then when there's a really big event, they'll have interagency control, and they'll pull all of those different firefighters together under a single kind of command structure. It has a lot of parallels to military activity and military command structure. So, but that's what you have to do when you're trying to organize and coordinate that many people in a really big event.
Have they been exempted from the shelter-in-place restrictions that have been put in the state? I mean, are the firefighters considered essential? You said you thought maybe the crews were a little bit smaller, the trainings were a little bit smaller. Is there
I heard that the trainings for new people were smaller, and so some of the crews, the actual hand crews, the crews that are going to go out and fight fires are smaller. I think at the stations where the firefighters are actually living and doing their work, I don't know that they. I think that they're probably, sheltering in place just like a family would, but they actually, for the stations where the firefighters actually live, they have 10-day shifts or whatever. I think that they almost are like a pod. They're living and sheltering together as if they were kind of a family, because they have to. They live and work together in pretty close quarters.
Mm-hmm. So they're already used to being in these sort of, almost quarantine wouldn't be the correct word, but they almost sort of live that way, huh?
They kind of, they do. I live very close to a fire station, so I get to see a lot of it. But yeah, it is almost like that.
So one of the things that there's been a lot of news reporting about, so worrying about hurricane season, and we talked about that on COVID calls on Monday, and worrying about fire season, which we're talking about today. In the context, so we have the pandemic, and then those things are coming. But it struck me that we've got also a lot of active hurricane and wildfire recovery communities around the United States. So if you want to know what that's going to look like, you actually don't have to look too far. You can go to Puerto Rico or Port Arthur, Texas, or North Carolina. And in California, there are also still ongoing recovery from the Camp Fire, I'm assuming, for example, and maybe other places. So how's the pandemic affected that?
Let's see. I mean, again, kind of anecdotal stories that I've run across and heard from people. I'm a little bit involved in the Camp Fire rebuild situation. It goes on. There's planning and public input on how that's going to play out. I know that there's also some rebuilding. I think in California, construction was not shut down completely. And so there has been rebuilding. I know lots of agencies, you can't as easily go into the planning department and get your permits approved and evaluated. But I think that it's probably slowed things down, but it hasn't stopped the recovery efforts in many areas.
So let me ask you just to this issue of preparing for this season, and so getting into some of these, some of the thinking right now about how you prepare people for a fire. psychologically, what kind of preparations need to go in, how you communicate risk. Walk us through that a little bit, and if it's been changing, because I mean, the long history of wildland fire in the United States for a long time was, I forget the time of day, it was 11 o'clock rule. Was that what it was? Every fire needed to be a Forest Service head,
right?
Something like that. So there would be no burning, and then that has changed, and I think maybe there's been some change in a lot of discussion about how to inform people how to act. Should they already evacuate? Should people shelter at home?
Sure.
Let's talk about those things.
Yeah. I think, the goal is to have people that are living on fire-prone landscapes, have them accept that inevitability and prepare for it, right? To live as if it's just going to happen, and you want to have taken whatever steps were needed for when that eventuality occurs. Because the worst thing that can happen is it can feel like a surprise, where you don't have your evacuation plan ready. You don't know where you're going to go. You don't know what you're going to take. You haven't spent the time prepping your own property, right? Cleaning we have what's called defensible space typically around the home ignition zone. And so out to some distance, there are different buffer distances away from the home, but you want to have cleared out any vegetation that could burn if fire were to come, or embers, burning bits of vegetation that come from relatively far away, often wind-blown embers. You got to think about that too. Where could those lodge and start fires in the gutters in the rain gutters if they're not cleaned out? You need to think about the attic and crawl space vents. Are they screened, or are they designed so that embers can't get in them? Do you have a wood roof, a wood shake shingle roof, which is really a terrible vulnerability in a fire-prone area? Trying to get people to think about, as the fire season approaches, think about the things they need to do to get ready for the fire season, and the things that they can do to their own home to reduce those vulnerabilities and reduce the chances of home loss. So historically, we've tried to get the agencies and the academics have tried to get people to know what to do. What are the highest priorities in those? Because it could be a very long list if you think of it, right? I mean, it could be a daunting list, and it could get very expensive. So we want to prioritize that and get the best cost benefit out of it in terms of reducing risk. You brought up shelter in place. I know we've been talking about shelter in place with respect to COVID, but
Right.
Shelter in place has a long history in fire too. That the implication there is that during a wildfire situation, you might not evacuate, and whether it's by choice or whether it's because you get the evacuation notice too late and you can't safely evacuate. The idea is that you may have to hunker down and weather the storm inside your home. And so all of the things that you would want to think about, given that possibility, you need to walk around your home and think about what you would do and how you might survive that, how your home might survive it. In contrast to COVID, where the authorities are telling everybody to shelter in place, and a mark of how well we're doing is how well we adhered to that. In fire, the authorities do not generally want you to shelter in place. They want you to get out. They want you to leave when they say it's time to go. So in the context of wildfire, it's usually if you can't get out, if you don't get a warning in time, if the fire is traveling too fast and you don't get a warning at all, what would you need to have done and thought about?
That it strikes me as a complicated set of risk messages, and it implies a lot of knowledge on the part of the resident, so that you should trust public authorities telling you, okay, it's time to go, and that you would have a sense of where to go and how. But then at some point the conditions make it such that you might have to shelter, and then how to know what might trigger those different things. I mean, to me, it sounds like a risk communication nightmare. It's not my particular area of research, but
no, you're right, Scott. It's really fuzzy, and it's fraught with some liability concerns. I mean, the fire agency folks generally don't want to talk about that, right? They don't even want that to be on the radar. They want the message to be very clear that when the fire comes and we give an evacuation warning, that you get ready to go, and when we give an evacuation notice, you go. And often it's not even talked about up until the moment when you're supposed to evacuate, where you're supposed to go, because the fire could be coming from a different direction if you think about it.
Sure.
Right? Often it's pretty clear. It's going to be coming from the wildlands over there. Right. But yeah, but even that, there's some variation there, and they might want you to head the different direction down a road because there's a roadblock and a backup, and lots of people die in their cars in an evacuation gone wrong. So I think from the agency perspective, it does make sense that they want the message to be simple. When the orders come, you go. Any discussion about, well, if you can't go, if you don't get out in time, here's all this stuff that you should do to your home and your property, and it makes for a challenging messaging and education campaign. But I think the Camp Fire in particular, with Paradise burning and so many deaths just in the last few years with the Camp Fire and the Tubbs Fire that burned into Santa Rosa, people have talked much more openly about what needs to happen if we can't get people out. There are vulnerable populations,
right,
that we need to worry about here. What do we need to have thought about for those circumstances? And ideas like local refuges of last resort. Should we harden some central public structures or facilities that if people can't get out, they have a safe place to retreat to? Not that they should go there if they're told to evacuate, right? If they can get out, you should get out. But if for some reason, if things go wrong, we just don't want a bunch of people not getting out and dying trying, right? So it has brought up interesting conversations and planning. The other thing that's interesting around that is firefighters are often assumed to go protect structures, right? Evacuate the people, send the firefighters in to protect structures. There's some talk of that shifting to protecting evacuation routes as the priority. Now, kind of imagine if the mentality, the whole culture shifts from protecting homes to protecting evacuation routes. That's going to have that could potentially have big impacts on home loss numbers and disasters. What we see as a disaster. Anyway,
let me stick with this issue of the vulnerable populations because I think that it really points to this problem of the disaster. When I think of a wildfire, it's not one thing. I mean, disasters are complicated. So, I mean, you've got smoke, and you've got heat, and then you've got disorientation, and then vulnerable populations, power outages, vulnerable populations who may be relying on power for oxygen or any number of other things.
Yeah.
So again, just sort of sticking with this issue of the focus having been on evacuation and not on shelter. That to me seems really profound and maybe speaks to something that I heard on Monday when I talked to Miriam Belbidia and Aaron Clark Ginsberg. They felt like we're in the middle of a kind of revolution. Maybe that's too strong. Hopefully we're moving into a sort of revolution in which vulnerable populations actually become the focus of emergency planning. They become the focus of risk communication. You sort of assume that those with means and capacity will mostly operate according to the networks that they have, their family, their church, their work, their whatever it may be. That you really should be doing the planning for these much more vulnerable populations who either can't evacuate or if they do evacuate, they're going to have special needs when they evacuate. I'd like to get your take on that because it really does flip things around in the way we think about how we prepare for the worst, right?
It does. It brings up a whole bunch of interesting thoughts. while in the wildfire context, historically, the primary view of the wildfire problem is that it's one of fuel accumulation and land management, right? It has really been assumed that that's where the problems lie, and that's where the solutions therefore lie. And actually, vulnerable populations don't really come up in that flavor, right, of conversation, that painting of the picture.
Right.
And I think when you consider wildfire more as a public health and safety issue, like we consider a lot of other, hazards, you get a really different set of conversations and a really different set of perspectives, and that's where this whole issue of vulnerable populations is huge. And again, I think the fires that we've had in the last couple of years really highlight that. It depends a little bit on how you define vulnerable, because in some agency reports, I have seen vulnerable kind of imply that they're communities that are exposed to wildfire, so therefore they're vulnerable, which is a little different than the way many and we are using it right here. We're thinking of people that for some reason are underserved, or they have fewer opportunities or resources to mitigate risk. Could be a socioeconomic basis, it could be age. Anyway, these are people that are vulnerable to greater impacts for whatever reason. And when we start thinking about that, it might even mean we plan our communities differently when we plan them, right? How you site hospitals, how you site senior living centers, whether you have built into the community some refuge of last resort for people who have these problems, they can't get out for whatever reason, or don't get the word in time. There's even some emphasis. Hey, this is a real Halloween.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, you're doing it right now. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
You just increased our number of viewers. It's fantastic.
Oh my gosh, so sorry. So sorry.
So I didn't put the live on air sign on the outside of the den, I guess.
It adds. We saw families yesterday. It's tremendous.
Real.
Yeah, we're home. If we have the privilege to be home,
working from home.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say is that the vulnerable populations, pre-fire, they are at a disadvantage because they don't have the resources, the means, often to either to get the messages of how to mitigate their own risk, or the resources to actually accomplish that. So often it takes money, to do some of this, or connections to have some of these things happen, right? And actually post-fire, there's a group that I've been working with at UC Santa Barbara here. Post-fire, they've kind of latched onto this idea of salience, that after a wildfire in a given place, and for a short period of time, communities have often the ability to influence, presumably, their local politicians and have something done, right? Look, we just had this event here. It's in the news. It's a salient event. And people are concerned. And they leverage that to actually have something done in the community, which is kind of counter, if you think about it, in some ways, to when you would want to do it or where you would want to do it in the first place. They just had a fire. They just had a giant fuel reduction event. So it's sort of a perverse outcome in a way, that when risk is low-ish, salience is high. And
right.
Anyway, they've also, I think, started to look into the fact that, richer, whiter, more educated communities are also probably able to have greater responsiveness in that process. And so, even in post-fire activities, not necessarily rebuilding, but post-fire, resources being put toward the fire problem, vulnerable populations from a socioeconomic perspective are going to be hampered there too, probably. So anyway, it plays out in all kinds of different ways, I guess.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking today to Max Moritz, and we're talking about wildfire and COVID-19. I just want to stick with this line just for a second more, Max, if you would, because it strikes me that pandemic, making some sense of how people have reacted to the requirements to shelter in place? Now we're talking about pandemic shelter in place.
Yep.
And the pushback to that, the nuances of that, and how that has been different state by state, and even within states, different rules about who can go out and under what conditions, that we should have been paying attention to the kind of work that people in the wildfire space have been doing for a long time now. I wonder what kind of transferability do you see there? And I guess I'm also curious on what you see the flip side. What are you seeing? What have you seen these last few months in the reaction to the pandemic that you can read back into wildfire preparedness?
Yeah. Again, some anecdotes. I think there are some interesting parallels or maybe contrasts because, in the shelter-in-place order for the pandemic, we had the rule followers actually doing that, and we had kind of maybe the more, self-sufficient or gallant or risk-taking folks not sheltering in place, right, and breaking some of the rules. In the fire context, it's flipped. It's the rule followers are the ones that don't shelter in place,
right?
And the more sort of, self-sustaining, resilient characters that feel like they can take it are the ones that actually try to shelter in place and expose themselves. So it's sort of a risk assessment. It's a personal risk assessment thing where each, in each context, the people that are more risk averse maybe are following the orders. If they trust the authorities and they're risk averse, they're going to follow the orders. And if they don't trust the authorities as much, or they're a little more risk taking, they might not, right? And I'm sure there are some parallels and lessons there. I don't have a great one off the top of my head right now.
But somewhere out there, there's a guy. It's probably a guy who is absolutely committed to the idea that if a fire comes, he's not leaving his house.
For sure.
And he's been the same guy. It's undoubtedly a guy who has been out and about in the pandemic, and even perhaps not wearing a mask, sort of flouting those rules because, hey, I don't need to do that. I mean, the president of the United States has been that guy.
Yeah. It's hard to say. I think because I have met both kinds. I've met some old timers that have seen a lot of fire, and they're just really comfortable with their own situation. They kind of know what to worry about, and they might very well be the kind of people that would take shelter in place for COVID pretty seriously. But I think you're right. There's also, a more macho, risk-taking type of character that falls into both of those. Yeah, both of those situations.
So the challenge it strikes me in a lot of this then is to understand the concerns of those people.
Absolutely, because
they have civil liberties concerns, or they have there's something motivating that and not to look, if they're putting other people at risk, we've got to take care of that. And I think that's been an issue in some places, but in most cases it's much more subtle than not, and not as clear. And you want to just have sort of risk communication that also reaches them, because if they're putting themselves at risk, we should care about that. Yeah,
we should, but we should also, at some level, if they're comfortable with it and they're not putting other people at risk, it's kind of their choice too, right? But the problem is, in many cases, it's putting other people at risk,
right.
And that's where I think people are denying the reality that it's putting other people at risk. If they're not wearing a mask because they feel like they're not going to get it, well, you've completely missed the point of the fact you're supposed to be wearing masks so other people don't get it in case you're a non-symptomatic carrier, right? And in the shelter, in the evacuation and shelter fire situation, it's not entirely true that people who shelter in place aren't putting somebody else at risk either, because if a firefighter knows that this entire neighborhood is empty and it's getting bad, and they can just leave and not worry. But if they know that one person is still back there sheltering in place, it's a totally different story, right?
And so they will go for them.
Typically, unless they simply just can't.
Yeah.
It's a much much messier situation then. Yeah.
Yep. I'm struck every time we talk, Max. I end up pulling you over into being a fire anthropologist. I pull you over into humanities and social sciences, and so when I want to shift over now, I want to talk a little bit about ecology. I want to talk more about science, and I'm curious, first of all, just how you're able to do your work, and thinking about this as something where we may be unsheltered for a while, and then we have to return back. I mean, I think this is going to be a situation with multiple. This is a play with many acts, and even a vaccine. People are sort of worried that that's a techno fix that we shouldn't rely on as much as some people are talking about. So, what's the impact for your research portfolio, particularly about getting in the field?
Yeah. I can't remember if we went into this at all. I don't think we did, but yeah, I had the field work that I have. Like I think we said earlier, we're getting off to a pretty slow start.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think that
you can tolerate that for a while.
Yeah, for a while. I mean, at some point, the plans that you had for covering a full fire season are not going to play out. We wanted to be out there at the beginning and sampling all the way down through the dry down. But the university has been pretty careful, and I respect that. And we're starting to see some ramp up guidance on how we might do that. I think the key is really, can we do it safely? Can we have all the protocols and the gear and everything that we might need to put people back out and do it well and do it safely? And that's, I think we got to make sure we can do that and do it right. So anyway, in a couple of weeks, we're hopeful that we'll actually be doing some of that field work again, so that we don't miss the whole fire season.
And the members of your lab, how do they work? Do they work in teams of two, or they have stations that they go to individually and gather data day by day, or I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but. Well,
it depends. There are some that are doing mostly computer modeling, and you can do that.
They're good.
They're good. And then, for example, the field and lab teams, they might be working in groups of two pretty commonly, maybe three occasionally. So, doing that with appropriate social distancing and whatever, if we're going to wear face masks and ventilate the rooms when they're inside versus, staying 6 feet apart and so on. I think it's all doable. We just have to make sure that we're doing it safely, right, and following the rules. And I think we're still going to get some really interesting stuff out of the fire season. I think one of the strange things that we're probably going to see is how wildfire and quarantine or COVID in general plays out. I've already seen guidance for evacuations, for example. If there's a fire and people have to evacuate, how are they going to do that safely? Probably the same as for hurricanes, right? Are we going to have temperature screenings before people go into a shelter? or an evacuation center, and so on. All that's gonna. I think there's some giant question marks, right, over how that's all going to play out and what we're going to learn from it.
Do you know who's doing that planning?
Well,
it's been unclear to me.
The local Office of Emergency Management has put out some guidance about that for here, for example, and I suspect that's happening everywhere. I don't know how consistent it is. Mm-hmm. That would be interesting too, to find out. Depending on the flavor of a given county, how that might vary. I don't know.
In some ways, it's corollary. We were talking about vulnerable populations and the complexity that adds. It's really a big gestalt switch for planners. And so is this sort of compound disaster or cascading disaster, whatever metaphor you want to use. And I'm curious how you think about that in the science. I'm been thinking a lot about how we can build crosswalks across different disciplines right now to think about complicated problems like this one.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. In ecology, we often hear people talking about compound disturbances or compound vulnerabilities, but this idea of compound, that any one event might fall within the natural range of historical variability for a given system. A big fire, it might seem really large, but if we look back through time, those fires of those sizes have occurred, unusual, rare, but they're not outside. They're not just complete outliers, right? They're somewhere in that cloud of the historical range of variability. And so whether it be a drought or a fire or a flood, these natural events, the systems are usually somewhat resilient to events that are within that range, that observed range. And where we don't know what's going to happen, or where we think we're going to see novel and possibly really negative, really catastrophic outcomes, particularly with climate change kind of ramping or priming these systems for more and more extreme events, are when you have sequences of events, compound events in sequence. So you have a flood or a fire followed by a flood, or a fire followed by a drought, or vice versa, a drought followed by a fire. Those, if they're really extreme events, lead to kind of no analog or unusual novel outcomes where you might have big system shifts, right, with real serious consequences. But that idea of novel sequences and compound disturbances, I think that could lend itself to what we were talking about, sort of in coupled human natural systems. How does something that's outside the norm, way outside the norm, and you have a couple of different events like that outside the norm, how does that really destabilize a system and lead to big shifts, big changes?
In the ecosystems you look at, what happens when you do have a big shift? How do you reach a new equilibrium?
So a great example in the shrublands of much of Southern California, chaparral is the plant community, and it's very fire prone, and many of the species are fire adapted in one way or another, as long as the fire, say, isn't too frequent. So, for example, if you had a compound disturbance, might be two really large fires back to back. That's going to happen so frequently that the native plants haven't regenerated, set seed, and they're not there to rebound after that second fire. Or, for example, a fire followed by a real extreme drought. That is very likely with climate change, and that has a big impact on what is able to regenerate after that fire. So you might get a lot less native regeneration and a lot more weedy, invasive, herbaceous, grasses that bounce back in their place. And those grasses can bring fire into that system now every single year, right? Instead of on a longer, decadal plus time scale with the native shrubs. So those are the kinds of big shifts that you can see that then persist, possibly, in our lifetimes forever, right? As long as there's fire now and grasses carrying fire into those systems, they're never going to come back as shrublands, for example. And the same thing can happen with forests. You can get type conversions as a result of some of these compound disturbances and novel.
Can you bring, even the use of the term novel here obviously makes us think of the novel coronavirus. Can we bring that kind of thinking over into, preparing for a pandemic and simultaneously, you just touched on it a minute ago, simultaneously preparing for wildfire, and then on top of that, preparing for the kind of racial, kind of civil unrest that's connected with racial injustice. We're talking about, and I know the analogies aren't perfect, but I think they're useful for me at least, to think with about how you have these systems that we tend to think of them somehow as separable. And then we find out that when you do begin to have all of these stresses simultaneously, they reveal things that maybe should have been visible all along, but then they become really, really evident. These systems that might appear, resilient, which is a buzzword, resilience now. It's really hard to define and quantify, but in isolation, these systems or these disturbances, these processes, they might be resilient to shocks to the system. But then when you have a bunch of interactions and novel compounding
interacting, extreme events that the resilience to this the systems just gets compromised. However you want to define resilience, it just has more and more trouble holding together and or bouncing back the way it always has. And in a social context, maybe that means there's some good that can come out of it, right? In an ecological context, it usually means there's a big negative outcome. We've lost the forest and it's become a degraded, system that it wasn't. It doesn't provide the same services or habitat. But at least in a social context, maybe, assuming we can learn from our past and our mistakes, maybe some good can come from the change.
And that was really what I was going to follow up with. I mean, there's such a strong rhetoric around learning from disaster, and I'm skeptical, not nihilistic, but skeptical of that sometimes. I think some of the deeper structures, like in California, the impetus to rebuild and real estate development being such a strong player, and that's true in coastal communities too. But what's your take on that in the wildfire space? Where do you see people learning? What kinds of things have you seen people learn after fire?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the, and for the sake of full disclosure, it's something that I've been interested in and pursuing. So it's an example that comes to mind for this. But one of the things that we're hearing more about is where and how we build our communities, right? I mean, that's obviously a big part of what we need to do right if we're gonna get ahead of this problem, the wildfire related problem and climate change that's making it worse. A lot of emphasis on where and how we build has gone in the past on building codes of the structure itself. The materials and the methods that are used in building the actual home, for example, have gotten a lot of importance, and hazard maps that guide building codes so that homes that are in this versus that hazard rating class are built up to certain standards. One of the things that we're learning, and it's a kind of an emerging and hopeful area of study, is that in addition to building codes, there are other issues about the siting and the layout of a community that are really important, and they're not codified anywhere. They're not regulated. So whereas building codes, at least in California and in some other places, building codes are regulated by by what hazard class they might be in for fire. Where you put the home on the property is pretty important. How you lay out the homes in the community with respect to, say, existing parts of the landscape that might be really fire prone, or they might be buffers, right? You can have agricultural lands, or you can have irrigated kind of green space, or you can imagine golf courses, that you could have the golf course around the community instead of the community around the golf course. There's all kinds of, I mean, that's kind of a silly, simple example, but it does highlight, we just haven't thought that much about that scale of planning and urban design. Clustered development is easier to defend, right? But with fewer firefighters, and built up to really stringent building codes, it's probably a lot safer than sprawly development. There's a whole bunch of things we're learning about the design and siting of new communities. I think that provides some hope that, for example, in California, we have a housing crisis, right? We don't have nearly the affordable housing that we need, but we can't just say no more building on fire-prone landscapes. We just have to do it smarter, right? And there's a bunch of things we're learning about how to do that.
I'm thinking again about, that's such, to me, a really profound lesson, because it brings a sort of human-centered design approach into all of this, and also a sort of hazards realism about, not to act as if these hazards might happen to us, or we hope they don't, or if they do, we wait for the fire service, or we wait for the CDC or the paramedic, but we actually take that I've been thinking about that in terms of elder care. And I know that's an issue, I guess, in fire as well. Hospitals, elder care, schools, places where there may be a higher standard of concern and care for where they're sited and standards of construction. It seems like another place where we could have been borrowing some lessons from fire to prepare for the pandemic.
Sure. Yeah. Elder care. Yeah. And schools, why aren't our schools just these places where, safety from all kinds of hazards is the first thing that goes into how they're laid out, how they're designed, how they're built.
Right. So I know we're almost up on time. I did have one little quick question I want to get a hit from you. And this is after the Camp Fire, President Trump made his trip to California reluctantly. And he said a lot of things about forests and about fire. He says a lot of things about disasters. And I wonder, how people in California have thought about that, or did they dismiss that as that's just pure politics? He's already got it in for California. But I mean, when the president of the United States speaks in depth about and uses terms like forest management, that puts a shiver up my spine, because that makes me think, well, there's other politicians who are going to hear that, and this could lead us into some unwise policy directions. Sure. Maybe I'm making too much of it, but how did that sound to you when he started talking about vacuuming the forest?
Well, raking the forest, and the one could hear what he was saying and take away the message that we just haven't logged enough of the forest, so we have a forest fire problem. And it's just forest managers came out saying that is just not true. There's definitely reasons to not to export our problems and buy foreign logged wood, because we should probably keep our keep that problem here and do it right if we're gonna face the reality of needing wood to build with. But logging and fire hazard are just two very separate issues. So most of the people that know anything about this just kind of shook their heads and said, he's got a very simplistic misunderstanding of the way the systems actually work. The other thing is, to look at all the home losses and fatalities that we had, and then actually make the leap that it's a forest fire problem is also a disconnect. Right? It's a wildland urban interface problem. These aren't even in traditional forests for the most part. These are in the built environment, many times in shrublands, but not places where a traditional fuels reduction in a forest might actually save a home. It's more about the homes burning, and the homes themselves are the fuel that carry the fire to the next home and the next home. So there were multiple layers of misunderstandings on a lot of what we're hearing.
I want to remind people you've been listening to COVID Calls, and tomorrow we're going to stick with discussion of compound disasters. I'm going to talk to Stephen Flynn and to Arnold Howitt. We're going to talk about public policy and 9/11 and terrorism and disaster preparedness and many other topics along those lines. And I want to thank Max Moritz for making an hour to talk about the pandemic and about wildfire. It's always a pleasure to see you and hear about what you have been up to. Max, thanks a million, and stay healthy out there.
Yep. Thank you, Scott. It was great to join you, and I appreciate the opportunity. Look forward to talking to you again.
Talk to you tomorrow, everybody, 5 o'clock.